It's not a question of why there are not super heavy battle tanks in Battletech, but more of why don't they work? Now, I love tanks. If you've been following my Battletech vlogs pushed up to the channel here under the Battletech playlist, I love mechs. I love tanks. I love the fact that mechs can engage tanks. Tanks can engage mechs. And big guns truly never tire. So it's only a natural progression for these tanks to get bigger and bigger and bigger till we have assault class tanks. But how does that fantasy, how does that narrative translate to the table? Because certainly in the inner sphere, the technology base, the manufacturing base can produce mechs. So why not massively, massively big tanks for the battle value, for the cost, for the ease of production, the complexity? It would make sense to be a little bit more efficient to have this massive tank with armor and firepower versus mechs. And there do exist some fine examples of super heavy or heavy, I define it as 100 tons. I know super heavy is its own class. 100-ton tanks. Here's your Atlas. Okay, here's your Behemoth. But the challenge is how the rules play out. Now, in my collection of tanks, I do have some 100-ton heavy tanks. I play them occasionally simply because I want to get the most out of my miniature collection. I love the idea of them, but they are very, very challenging in all but the smallest, most narrowest band of missions. And quite frankly, even in those type of mission bands, I might be better off taking some combined firepower because of how initiative works. And we'll keep that tactica in mind in a moment, to follow up on in a moment. The challenge with tanks in Battletech, it's the rules. Not that there's anything wrong with the rules, but the rules work two ways for vehicles. They tend to be cheaper. You can mount equally devastating weaponry on them. It's not like, look, here's mech weapons and here's tank and vehicle weapons. You know, a PPC can only be mounted on a mech because of XYZ, so it can't be on a tank. No, you can mount the same weapons. Look at the Shrek PPC carrier. I mean, that thing makes awesome pilots start to sweat. So from that perspective, yes, vehicles are cheaper. They bring a lot to the table, but they don't have the mobility of battle mechs. Certain terrain can challenge them. The biggest challenge, of course, is the critical hits and the motive hits. This idea of as they get hit, especially on the side, they start losing tracks, they start taking damage to the wheels, the drivetrain, they quickly slow down and become immobilized. Now, if they become immobilized, all perhaps is not lost. You might be playing with the force withdrawal or abandonment rules, which essentially says if a vehicle becomes immobilized, the crew realizes, hey, we're sitting here, and they bail out. I don't necessarily agree with that, but even if we put that rule aside for a moment, if you have a turret, you're okay. This is why I like the Demolisher tank and other tanks with the turret. If you don't have a turret and you get immobilized, you're sitting there the whole game. I mean, the one game that comes to mind, House Davian was invading a planet, trying to take a spaceport. My mercs are holding that spaceport against incredible odds. And I had deployed some infantry on the outer edges of the city with the idea I was just going to try and ambush stuff. I mean, I can't let you walk into the city, but of course, naturally, I'm going to have a ring defense, and the spaceport is going to be the fortress, and I've got some artillery to fire out. So I put in some infantry in the buildings, mostly like close punch SRM infantry. They bust out. They do what they got to do. Then they take some losses. They run. But one of the infantry stands, just through luck, there was a von Luckner, which is a heavy, it's a potent tank. It's a heavy tank. It was leading a column of vehicles. My SRM infantry jump out, hit the von Luckner with SRM fire on the side. It's a good volley of fire. But I got lucky. Hey, anything happens in the fog of war. I immobilized this tank. So imagine we're playing on this massive table. Turn one, I immobilize your tank. Okay, it's still initiative because you're going to burn that initiative. But that tank was sitting there the whole game. Was sitting there the entire game. I mean, it's pretty interesting. So from that perspective, at least if you have a turret. The challenge with the super heavy tanks like the Behemoth, they move urban mech speed. So not only are you redeploying nowhere, if it's a very, very fast, if it's a very, very fluid game, well, you wouldn't bring that tank to begin with, but you're in trouble. It's vulnerable to being outflanked. It's vulnerable to just run and gun suicide stuff. It's not going to be destroyed because it's got 100 tons of the armor. But the motive hits quickly chew it down to nothing and quickly immobilize it. So from that perspective, that's where it doesn't work. We're not even talking about a heavier armed vehicle that's slow, but still has some good speed and can take some hits. The Behemoth is just too heavy. It just takes way too many motive hits and grinds down. Okay, so now you say, well, if it's City Fight, City Tech, I mean, there was one game where I had two Behemoths, one on one side of the table dug in, one on the other side of the table dug in, because the clans were attacking coming off table. And I didn't know. So right away, clans versus Inner Sphere, I had a lot more battle value to work on. So I wanted to have these two Behemoths as anchor points, because if the clans came in on one side in full force, the Behemoth was going to work. If they were going to divide their forces, that would work. If they were going to attack one area, but maybe an outflank in another area, I had both of those covered for the battle value. But the challenge there, that wasn't fully effective, because while they came in on one area and a few light elements came on the other, they quickly, just, classic lightning war, they quickly moved past the other Behemoth, and there's no way it was going to redeploy. So that's wasted battle value, or I should say not efficient battle value, although I still had the initiative. Now, in the case where you're playing on a smaller board, attacker versus defender, and you look and say, okay, the Behemoth, you get a lot of stuff, or a heavy tank, 100-ton tank, you get a lot of stuff, a lot of armor, low battle value. Fritz, if it gets motive hits, it's hull down, it's essentially going to just stand there and be just a tank. That works. Yes, that does work, but would I be better off taking, if we just look at the weapons profile that you get, for the battle value, would I be better off taking two heavy end medium tanks or a heavy tank, taking two of them for the same battle value, same weapon output? Now I've divided it into two other targets, more importantly, two initiative sinks, right? The Behemoth or these super heavy tanks are only one initiative sink. I could easily divide it, reduce the challenges of getting chewed up with motive hits. But again, even if it's static, taking two, I now have two initiative sinks that I can utilize, whether it's versus Inner Sphere or clans. So I find, yes, it's in my collection. I play them from time to time just because I love the idea of massive tanks. I love the idea of wanting to use all of the miniatures in my collection. But as a pure Tactica, the very thing that works for vehicles, low battle value buy-in and tremendous weapons platform, the counter these heavy tanks, the fact that they don't move fast, that they're very, very slow, combined with the balance in the rules for motive hits and being immobilized and other critical hits, it makes them extremely, extremely vulnerable. Better off taking 2 for 1 than going 1 for 1.